it became more and more present to me that the economics that we have in front of us, at least the economics that I know, are not enough to create the narrative and to have to think about the broad policies required to deal with the challenge. So I put myself to the task, and I feel a little bit, as I said, humbled by that, of sharing with you some of my thoughts on what is wrong with the economics that I have been taught, and how and what kind of economics we need, and what kind of inputs we need in order to discuss transformation, decarbonization. So I have to also share with you that in the past 3 years, I was part of an international think tank called the World Resources Institute, which a leading initiative called the New Climate Initiative, which is exactly to give some economic rationale and narrative in showing that the transition for a low carbon economy can be socially and economically beneficial for all countries, but particularly developing countries. So let's go to the next one. I have plenty of slides. I hope that my PowerPoint does not become powerless and pointless. So please try to focus more on the ideas and the discussions rather than the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is just for me to follow. So what are the challenges in front of us? I think that, and please the next one. I see, as I saw in the 2010, Camila, can you project the next one? There was some issues that were clearly showing that we were at the brink of contradictions of the globalized systems that we had before, that if were not addressed would be catastrophic. One is rising inequality, which is a moral impediment, a moral issue, but it also has economic consequences. It leads to a less dynamic and, of course, less inclusive society. But it has, if you just looking at the profit equation of Kalecki, and we're going to go back to that, you see that there are economic consequences. The second thing is climate emergency. I mean, what we call now climate emergency in 2010s, we're looking at the possibility of that happening, and the physical and economic impacts growing to a point of no return. Unlike any economic analysis that we had in the past, we did not anticipate points of no return in terms of uses of resources. The third thing is that in the 2010s, it was very clear that we are entering an age of insecurity. Social, economic, and political uncertainties are rising very fast, the polarization, the anger, and so on. Finally, you would observe the beginning of geoeconomic fragmentation, and I want to discuss this with you later on. And that has to do with increasing stress on the global and national economies. Next one, please. So where do I see we are? Climate emergency is not just a thought, it's already there. Climate has changed, and in a much faster pace than we had expected before. And sorry, I have to put my glasses because this is too small for me. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, do not hesitate to stop me any time, either to ask a question or to point out that I'm wrong, because I'm possibly wrong many times in this presentation, okay? So climate has changed, and now we face a true emergency, and in a much faster pace. Nowadays, we can observe climate change just by watching the TV in different parts of the world, and then some of the other diagnoses of the 2010s have been confirmed in terms of the social impacts. The poorest ones, the poorest people are the ones being more affected. The second thing that you observe is that the after 2 years after the pandemic, the supply disruptions, the supply chain disruptions, geoeconomic fragmentation. Geoeconomic fragmentation is a catchword to say that the two pillars of the globalized economies, the United States and China, are in open war, and that has consequences. Economic war, but at the verge of some more serious conflicts. So this has, of course, existential impacts, but also has economic immediate impacts. And you see that in the terms of exacerbating the supply side disruption. And you have food insecurity already happening before the Russian invasion, which is the next one, which had to a significant boost of commodity prices, particularly energy, but also grains, more supply disruption, and even further acceleration of food insecurity and poverty. Now we are facing a situation of global inflation, and this is where all the economists, and particularly the mainstream economists, are lost, because you don't have in any economic theory the case of sustained shocks affecting the prices, supply shocks. You have shocks as shocks. They should not be permanent. They should not have a permanent impact in inflation. So the struggle is what to do with that. Now, go on. Next, Camila, please. Now, this is where I live in Washington, D.C. I used to be at the World Bank for many years at the IDB. And I know that economics has progressed quite substantially. I mean, from institutional economics to behavior economics to modern money theory, there are people thinking outside what I would say the mainstream economics. But when we talk about mainstream economics, is where most of economists are, how most of economists think, how they were trained. And I take the World Bank and the IMF as a way of seeing how the thinking is going. And from what you see from the World Bank, the interesting thing is that it has gone nowhere. The World Bank continues to see the need for structural adjustments in face of crisis, does not know how to deal with the impacts and supply side impacts on inflation and so on. So it's proposing for emerging markets the same old recipes that they would propose before. And the interesting thing, if you look at the IMF, next one, please. The IMF is coming with a completely different kind of approach. Basically, from the macroeconomic perspective, they're saying we need to create the fiscal space, but also to think outside the box in terms of the use of policies in order to address the need for to address the issues in front of us, but also the issues of transformation in the long run. So strangely, if you look at what the IMF has been saying, and I share this presentation with you, you don't have to worry about looking at the specific sayings, but the IMF is saying the economics that we know. The IMF, which stands, as you all know, for is mainly fiscal, not the International Monetary Fund, but the whole thinking is being challenged. The reason for, in my view, that the IMF is being challenged for that is because the IMF's policy proposal affect at the same time developed economies and developing economies, and has a very strong European leadership. And therefore, they can, unlike the World Bank, where the policies are mainly towards the developing countries, the IMF has to be much more broad in its policy approach to its constituencies. That creates this tension in the IMF. They propose to have a completely different type of macroeconomic policies for the developed economies. When it comes to developing economies, they become a little bit less precise and more going back to the same old recipes. Next one. So my take of this situation is this. Next one, Camila, please. My take from this situation is, can you move change the transparency, Camila, please? I cannot, well, I don't know if you have seen, but my take for this is this. First of all, if you want to listen to good economics, avoid listening to World Bank nowadays, and quote Kristalina, who is the managing director of IMF, for anything interesting coming from mainstream economics, especially the Washington-based mainstream economics. The second take that is definitely, I mean, the biggest challenge that you have in terms of traditional macroeconomic policy is how emerging and developing countries can create room of maneuver, not just on the fiscal side, but on the policy side, because they have to make a transition just like anybody else and become more resilient to the shocks that have been received. But they have particularly macroeconomic management systems that it constrains pretty much the room of maneuver. The third point that comes to me is that even though most of economists are perplexed with the number of issues in front of them, and particularly when addressing supply side shocks and needs for change in the supply side, what we used to call the production function, they have no way of responding from the current mainstream economics. Now, move on, please. So where do we go from here? And this is I'm sharing with you my concerns in relation to the economic profession. It's clearly, there's a clear need for transformation. This transformation requires policies that will lead to profound socioeconomic environmental, to deal with the socioeconomic environmental crisis. A significant part of this transformation are supply side, the institutional, and social. They require supply side changes, institutional changes, and social changes. They involve, and this is what I want to focus a little bit, transformative investments, some of them of very high volume. We'll come back to that. In order to do that, you have to realign macro, meso, and microeconomic policies in order to get the result fast. You have to move fast, and you need to align those policies. And my conclusion from that is that it's beyond our perplexity. We need to be able to have an economic narrative, but also link that economic narrative to policy changes that can address those meso, institutional, and meso, micro, and macroeconomic issues. So let's move on a little bit. Anybody has any questions thus far? Okay. Why do we need transformation? Why and what we need to transform? Let's take a look at the situation when it comes to inequality. The rise of inequality in the past 30 years has been significant, but in the past decade has been brutal. This is something that needs, it's beyond just looking at the moral issue. It's looking at how this is impact not only how the social justice, but how this is impact the economics as we know nowadays, and how you portray the economic situation. Again, inequality has not only increased within countries quite substantially, but also among countries, in between countries, in countries and between countries. So inequality is rising in a pace that becomes truly it has always been an economic issue in the political economy tradition, but has become an issue that is truly impacting our way that we see things from an economic perspective. Climate change is already moved to the next one. Sorry, Camila. Next. Next. Next, Camila. And next. Sorry, I should have showed those two PowerPoint slides there. Next one, Camila, please. So climate change is accelerating, and that is all the results that we expected to observe are occurring. But in some cases, the amount of environmental destructions is leading us to a point of no return. This is particularly with the forest and the ocean. The forest, as you know, for instance, you are in Brazil, the speed, and that's not just not created by any economic force, but a political force associated with inequality. We can discuss with this later. But the level of destruction has been so rapid that some scientists look at the next 20 years as the possibility of achieving a point of no return, where the Amazon becomes a savanna. If the Amazon forest, the rainforest, if that happens, this is going to impact what is called the flying rivers. I don't know if most of you may know it, but the Amazon produces, through evaporation, produces a river that goes all the way from the Amazon region, going down to the south. And this is one of the reasons why you have one of the most productive agriculture in Brazil, but also in other parts, for instance, in Argentina and so on, because you have that ecosystem coming all the way down from the Amazon. The decline, if the Amazon becomes a savanna, this is going to impact significantly the productive capacity of Brazil, but also since Brazil is one of the largest producers of agricultural products, this is going to impact food security, geopolitics, and so on, so on, so on. So this is just an example of Brazil. You can see the example in other parts of the globe. Very few in a favorable way, like in Canada, you would also probably increase the productivity of agricultural production, but it won't change the major trends. So, and it's quite clear that the climate emergency can only be changed. The emergency is already here, but the trajectory can only be changed if action is taken right away in terms of decarbonization of the economy. And the interesting thing is that the benefits of doing so are not just environmental. We talk about that, but also economic. And so there's a lot of benefits coming from this trajectory, but that is not being transformed in climate action. Now, next, please. This is, if you look at any of those studies in terms of just energy transition, but also all types of transition to low carbon economy, you're going to see that the increase of GDP, but also employment, and all the social benefits come from that. And even though those benefits are clear, they're not transformed into economic policy. Now, next, please. So what are the dangers of us continuing this path is that we may end up with a social crisis that is unprecedented in terms of the food insecurity that is creating, and that creates social turmoil as well. In terms of economic purely economic factors, this is going to lead to lower long-term growth potential and employment, also losses of productivity, and impacts on social and economic development. Financial, we have the risk of being locking in situations that for countries will become what is called stranded assets. For instance, if you are locked in coal production, like Colombia is, or Mexico is, or Brazil in unsustainable agriculture, you may end up in the loss of one of the most critical sectors for economic development. And of course, climate impacts are going to increase, and the events are going to become even more common. Next one, please. This, I think for me, it strikes as not odd that you have at the same time rising inequality and climate, the effects of climate change, both on creating geopolitical tensions and domestic tensions, but also other social problems such as food insecurity. It's not surprising that the world is becoming more uncertain. It's becoming more uncertain because nobody knows exactly. Well, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a train coming towards us. So unless something is done very quickly to address this, the tragedies that come with that, certainly the economy will become more and more volatile in the future. Now, finally, even though some countries have used the pandemic and the fiscal package that came with the pandemics in order to address some climate issues, the progress has been very, very slow. Now, why do we go back and forth with this? Next one is much more complex than just economics. But my point next, here, Camila, please, next. Next. The point that I want to make with you is that from an economics point of view, we have not achieved a comprehensive narrative that allows us to overcome a thinking that has dominated the economic discourse for so many years. Even though I perceive progress in many parts of economics, including in the heterodox tradition of the political economy transition, we have not yet created a mainstream narrative that puts decarbonization and transformation as something that both is required, is possible, and can be achieved in the short and in the medium run. Next, please. Now, I want to start with something, and going through, as I said, this is not, I don't want to be ambitious enough to say that I'm going to present here something on history of economic thought, because, as I said, I'm not an academic anymore. I used to be. But I want to, as I was putting together this class, I was going back and saying, what are the main, in my mind, as an old macroeconomist, what are the main narratives that are still prevalent in the things that I read? First one is one that goes back to the parable, which is not present in Smith's Wealth of Nations, but what I call Smithian parable on the production specialization and the explanation about the sources of productivity and economic progress. And we come back to that. The second one is this view that the market or the capitalist economy should be seen as a class-divided economic system, which has institutionalized class division and creates tensions that will make the economy move. So in this mission parable, there's no necessary movement, as we will see. In Marx class-divided economic systems, there are so many contradictions. The system is contradictions prevail so much they will move by coming to a contradiction, to enhancing the internal contradiction. and the Keynesian monetary production economy, which for me is an extraordinary, I would say, a pragmatic approach in this way, which looks at the institutions a little bit like Polanyi described before, some of the institutionalization of money, labor, and capital as a commodity, and creating a whole hierarchy in the function of the economy, and leading to a discussion on economic equilibrium and on cycles that is completely different from anything that Keynes had before. I know this sounds a little bit too wordy, but I'll come back to this. I hope this is going to be clear. So what I think has prevailed, despite all the progress that he had in economic thinking, is the first one. And this has to do with the fact that you have the Marshallian revolution, but particularly the Varasian next one, kind of the prevalence of the rational farmer fable that you had since the beginning of last century, and that we still attract so much attention, is in the subconscious of every mainstream economist, or I would say trained economist. This fable is the following. I mean, it's to look at economic units, to describe the economy as a set of economic units, that independent economic units that maximize utility and maximize profits. I mean, maximizing utility and maximize profits, if you look at one agents only, it becomes the same thing. And that economy, you can describe the whole functioning of the economy by defining the decision-making of these unities in terms of preference, either preference in the division of the use of current output into consumption and investment, or using that part of that output as in form of savings. At the end of the day, what you end up is in a situation where you can show that an economy described that way, savings is going to be defined by the interest rate, which is the natural interest rate, which is the remuneration for not consuming, and investment is going to be defined by the technology that is available for production, or the marginal productivity of capital. And then when you look at money in this perspective, it doesn't change anything. And that was the role of the quantitative theory of money, to show that if money is just the ways of circulating in the economy, and given the level, the technology of production and the preference, money becomes just a veil which makes no difference in describing how this economy functions. Now, go ahead, move a little bit more. So money does not exist in that parable because it's not necessary, even though money was known to be a significant innovation. The fiat money had become a significant innovation many years before these first formulations. So that created for some economists, particularly the early neoclassical economists, the issue of what is the role of fiat money and credit in a credit-driven economy, where you have banks that everybody knew were capable of producing credit in advance for investors that needed and therefore could use those resources in order to direct resources. So of course this brought a whole perspective, which is the Wickselian perspective, to show that, and you go to the next one, that this will not change significant. Camila, next one, please. This will not significantly change the perspective that you had before how the real economy changed, and how the real economy functioned. If you had money being created, money would create inflation. Inflation would be, in a way, be the means through which you end up creating movements, but there's a long-term tendency of equilibrium where savings and investments are equalized by the rate of interest and the marginal productivity of capital. Now, next one, please. The same thing applies when you introduce, for instance, bonds market. The story is repeated there. Next one, please. And I think I can go faster. And next one, please. The idea here is that the bond market does not change the structure of the story or the narrative. And therefore, we come to the overall conclusion that first, introducing money does not change the parable. The economy continues to be basically moved by the preference of consumers and the maximizing maximizing the utility functions of these agents. Financial markets, either developed banks and other financial markets, are just mere intermediaries of savings. And their structure and functioning cannot change the levels in the trade of investment. And therefore they cannot change the supply side of economy except for marginally. Aggregate supply, therefore, depends on the state of technology and changes discretely as function of investments. Economic policies may be affected by confusing markets, but then the markets, and that's what it became quite establishing later on, and markets cannot be fooled all the time. And the other thing that is really important, that in this parable, the state is an outsider in the model. Interventions can only be destabilizing forces. They cannot create permanent changing in the supply or aggregate demand. The next, please. The idea that this idea becomes very, it is the prevailing view that you observe in either closed economy models, but also open economy models. So having it in international integration does not change anything substantially. Okay. Now, of course, next one. This view of the economy was profoundly changed by the principle of demand of effective demand. And the point that I want to make is that even though the principle of effective demand did change the way you perceive the function of the economy, because the part that was most important in Keynes, which in my view was the institutional setting behind the principle of effective demand, but also the issue of dealing with uncertainty was not fully addressed for its followers in the neoclassical synthesis, and we end up in the same place that we were before. Next one, please. So as you know, the principle of effective demand in Keynes established that investments and also autonomous expenditure, and that depends on the marginal efficiency of capital. Marginal efficiency of capital and the interest rates, and the interest rate is determined in the money market as a function of supply and demand for money. And of course, in the demand for money, you have speculative demand, which creates forces that were beyond those that were perceived in the earlier models in terms of maximization of intertemporal preference. Now, this model, as presented, was rapidly changed or minimized in terms of transforming uncertainty and particularly that dominated the investment function and dominated the money demand function into issues related to risk and return. That made it very simple, much easier to look at these issues as, again, in the same format of the description of the economy as the one that prevailed with this Mission farm parable. Next one, please. Next one, please. From there, I mean, the supply side, so the aggregate side was pretty much looked very similar to what was conceived before, except by introducing the risk factor, which can be, in the case of repetition of the same events, can be reduced to just the natural rates. The final blow, I think it comes with the Phillips curves and the transition that you have there. With the Phillips curves, and that's the next one, please. Describe the supply side of the economy. Next one, please. This next one, please. Describe the aggregate supply function in the way that is pretty much similar to the old production function. When you look at the two main components, labor and capital. If you assume that the technology of capital is fixed, it's the preference of workers defined as the real wage that they want to sell the labor that is going to define finally the supply, the aggregate supply. Any attempts to change that through economic policy is only going to result in disequilibrium and in the form, for instance, of inflation. So having the system go back to the idea of a natural unemployment rate really leads to the same overall vision of the economy, the function of the economy as prevail principle of the effective demand. Next one, please. So this is the logic. I mean, once that, the final coup to this, in order to return, is the rational expectations theory, when you basically try to show that if you have rational expectations, if you have all the information available in order to, throughout time, make your decisions, you're going to end up being capable of anticipating the impacts of policies, and therefore you're going, the long run, going to have a return to the natural rate of employment, and then therefore the full employment barrier. So there we go. We are going to go back. We go back again. So next one, we go to a situation where you go back again to having the supply side determined basically by the preference of workers in terms of how much they want to spend their time and how want they be remunerated. The technological constraints. You have an investment function that goes back to being defined by the equilibrium in the capital markets, the translation of investments into savings into investments, and you have the natural rate of interest being that one that equilibrates the capital market, and you go back to the quantitative theory of money, and that's where we basically end up in terms of mainstream economics since that. Next one. So in this description, next one, please. In this description of the economy, what can go wrong in terms of the function of the full function of the economy? Either you have incomplete markets, for instance, in the case of the Aldershot, in the earlier work of Aldershot, when they described the impacts of financial underdevelopment in the allocation of savings and investment. And they propose financial policies in order to overcome that. It can come from financial repression when you try to repress one of those equilibrium of those markets in order to achieve a policy goal, such as, for instance, maintaining the interest rate below the natural interest rate. The third one, what can go wrong? External shocks. Anytime an external shock is going to, and that includes the shocks coming from policies, is going to affect the well-functioning of the economy. And then finally, that was introduced in a way, in a heterodox way, by Stigl and Weiss when they talk about information asymmetries. Basically, if you look at a general equilibrium model, you'd say, well, let's say that if information is not fully well distributed, what are the consequences of that? And we know from that, you achieve all kinds of results in terms of the effectiveness of economic policies in achieving a higher level of production and employment. Last, none of that, Camila, next? Both from, Camila, next, yes, no, that's one before, but anyways, both of them, in all of this, is in the neoclassical synthesis to the rational expectations. What you lose a lot of things, but one particularly important thing is that you lose understanding of how the supply, the aggregate supply, is changed in a modern market economy. Now, so we have the problem. I want you, next one, please, Camila. I want you to take a breath here and to make a little bit of sense what I've been saying to you. We have a problem. The problem is that we need to produce transformations. Transformations, most of them come from the supply side. To make changes in the supply side, you have to have economic policies that are based on the understanding of how main economic agents react to your policies. And we have built a mainstream economics where agents and where, first of all, institutions do not matter, finance does not matter, and agents cannot be moved by short-term or even long-term economic policies. To the contrary, they may move, but this is going to be destabilizing rather than producing positive changes. So going through this very quickly, we see that we have a problem to address. Now, I propose that in order to address that problem, we go back to discussing the Keynes' view on the monetary production economy, but also having some help from Kalecki and Schumpeter to look at the issues of distribution of income and wealth distribution, but also the impacts of innovation in order to make the supply curve change in a positive way. Next, please. Now, before we go to that, do we have any questions? Okay, so let's go back to the monetary production economy and the principle of effective demand. I think that it is one of the main points, some of the main points of the that were not made explicit in the principle of principle of effective demand, that were embedded in several parts of Keynes' description of the monetary production economy, are really critical in order for you to understand the political economy of a transformation decarbonization. First, the existence of fiat money, that comes from the treatise and other parts, is the true founder of the capitalist economies that we know now. It's not just, it's just not an appendix to it. It's the founding institution that was the basis of organizing the economy. is the institution that allows for the allocation of resources in a market economy. Whoever possesses the capacity to issue money, either the state and then later the commercial banks and other forms of issuers, have the control of the command of resources. It's not savings, and it's not the consumer that defines that. Is basically those who hold the capacity to create money in some form or shape. Second, investments in a monetary production economy is the ultimate cause of changes both in aggregate demand, but also in changes in aggregate supply. And I'm not talking about just the level. An investment is the way where changes in technologies are introduced in the system. Third, the interest rate is determined by supply and demand of money in what became known later on as the liquidity preference theory of the interest rates. The major player in that is whoever issues the dominant money in the economy. In the case of most market economies, the central bank. The central bank, and this is a point that has been made by many other heterodox economists, particularly in the money theory, modern money theory authors, is that it becomes the prominent in the determination of interest rates of the whole systems. Finally, bankers and investors, not consumers, rule. They are the ones that determine how the system changes. They determine the pace of growth, the technological change, and long-term changes in the aggregate supply and demand. If you want to have an impact in terms of changing the supply, aggregate supply, you have to find ways of aligning those actors, those main actors, not savers or consumers. So, next one. Next one, Camila. Yeah, go back. Sorry. So go back to that one. No, go back to one. Sorry. So in a way, what Keynes was attempting to do. Next one. Next one. Yeah, stay there. Sorry, stay there, please. The previous one. In a way, what Keynes was doing was not just redefining the established view in macroeconomics. He was founding macroeconomics. He was saying that the behavior of the behavior of agents in aggregate terms differs completely from how it was perceived before in macroeconomic terms. He did not bother to change, to change the view on the function in the macroeconomic level, but for sure, both the hierarchy of the agents and the functioning of the markets changed in absolute for terms from the micro to the macroeconomic level. Next one. Next one, please. So that's where in the general theory he presented his principle of effective demand without feeling the need of going back and saying, so what are the main institutional and social features behind that? I mean, the creation of money and the creation of banks, the structure of the financial structure, the role of the rules of the game in establishing and anchoring long-term expectations. And of course, he did not talk about income distribution. For instance, if Kalecki's view became predominant, that would become much more clearly when Kalecki said, well, the way to look at that is by assuming that income distribution also shapes the way the aggregate demand takes after the investments take place. But none of that was discussed immediately in the presentation of general theory, counting perhaps that the discussion, the level of discussion, or the level of debate would have to go to a much higher place, and that some of the features of his monetary production economy were already defined. Now, for instance, go next one, please. The issue of if savings is not the source of funding investment, how he explained, is interesting how he explained the relation between investment and savings into the general theory, which is basically by using the multiplier to show that if you start a process of investment, you're going to end up with the savings at the same level. He did not care about discussing how that additional savings was being allocated and what was the importance for that. Now, go next one. I think that many others have come in order to clarify much later on, and particularly Minsky was very important in so many levels. But when the discussion, for instance, of his financial theory of investments, he showed very clearly that there wasn't to look at how throughout the multiplier process, savings was being allocated, was important to discuss, to understand the issues that come in terms of sustainability of investment throughout time. He did that, go next one. He did that by showing, for instance, that throughout the process of investment, as you continue to invest because the price of investment, the demand price of investment, or the long-term expectation improves, you tend to reduce your risk, augment your risk appetite, and borrow more. At the same time, that this creates for the lenders a pressure in terms of perceiving the level of leverage increasing. So the perception of risks between lenders and borrowers are defined as separate issues, and it is the equilibrium between lenders and borrowers' risks that at the end of the day is going to define the financial limits for the continued investment. With that, next one. He reintroduced the issue of uncertainty into the discussions of from the financial perspective into the discussion of the determination of the investment level. Having said that, I mean the issue is you can have a discussion about how the investment is going to be impacted by the supply of funding, how this is going to be impacted, and how this is going to be impacted by increasing risk levels and uncertainty, and how that creates, for instance, financial fragility and therefore and later financial crisis. But it does not say a lot about how this investment is going to impact the aggregate supply, or what are the next one? What are the other reasons for to define or to describe the marginal efficiency of capital? I think that comes better from a Schumpeterian perspective. When Schumpeter basically puts innovation as the main source of changing long-term expectations of course, the innovators, and how that creates a long-term expectation that tends to also impact the liquidity preference of the suppliers of credit, therefore creating the basis for reallocation of resources, moving the economy from one point of equilibrium to another point of equilibrium. As a matter of fact, there's some authors that say that the equilibrium approach was not present always in the Schumpeter narrative. But for me, what's really important is that Schumpeter showed that innovation at the same time changed long-term expectations of the investors and long-term expectations of the financial markets. If you put that story together with Minsky, you can understand not only the financial side of the investment theory, but also you can understand how this is going to change in a fundamental way the supply side of the economy. Now, oops, I think I'm almost in my time and I have not reached even the point that I wanted to reach. So let's go to the next one, please. Schumpeter also showed very clearly the power of finance, something that was completely neglected with the neoclassical synthesis. Well, Keynes himself did not explore that much, but in discussions about how what was the role of banks in moving the economy from one level of production to another level of production, which had with his finance funding discussions. But Schumpeter put it right on spot. He said banks are the ones that are capable, as they change the expectations, are capable of creating the credit that allows innovators to make the investments, use the resources in a different way, and at the same time make changes in the supply side of the economy. Now, last one. Next one, please. Oh, sorry, I jumped the summary beyond train before repair. Okay, so if you want to think about the narrative of the economy, giving those insights, first of all, you have to reconsider, put into your modeling the fact that investments are determined by long-term expectations and credit conditions. That's the one before. Sorry, Camila. Camila, before. Yes, that's that one. That one. Stop that. No, go back there. Back. No. Number. Yes, next. 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 No, you're going go to 58 or 50. Sorry, 50. Okay. Investments are determined by long-term expectations and credit conditions. Animal spirits matter, but innovation changed the expected returns of sectors. Supply of adequate funding and finance and funding is critical. Policies matter in a fundamental way by providing the grounds for innovation, creating appropriate financial and non-financial incentives, and defining a path of growth that shape long-term expectations. Now, next one. Now, where to start? I mean, given that we have so little basis to understand, how economic policies and function in transformation, decarbonization, where to start and where to go? Go to the next one. The first main concern that you should have when it comes to that is that you have to have a clear understanding of the economic benefits of decarbonization. And this is where I stumble with some of the problems. Most of even the heterodox economists that are talking about Green New Deals and transition, they use general equilibrium, computerized general equilibrium models that are as a way of saying, okay, we have to have a system-wide view of the economy. So how do we do that outside a general equilibrium model? And they use something that is a compromise. If you go to the next one, this is the next one, Camila. This is the typical model that you find in even heterodox environmental economics. You redefine the production function in order to introduce natural capital. It says that factor markets natural capital, note that natural capital as a factor, land, extractive natural resources, others, and the model goes on from there. I mean, you have production functions which defines natural capital as one of the factors and go from there. But the problem, if you look up in the non-government capital account and households, is that it goes back to the same issues, assuming that finance and savings are endogenous determined, and that they are the same thing, and they're intermediated either through the government or through markets. which of course goes completely contrary to the view that finance should not be seen as coming from savings, but coming from the capacity of banks and other financial institutions to provide liquidity. The second thing is that the investment function there is endogenously determined. It's basically determined by changes of relative prices and throughout the process of decarbonization, leading therefore to long-term expectations in relations to for the investors. Next one. Now, having said that, those models are capable of giving some direction. Next one, please, Camila. Some directions of the benefits coming from a process of decarbonization. Those are some examples that have been, for instance, developed by different authors for Europe, for East Asia, South Asia. They all show the same thing. If you define one line of a highly carbon economy and you look at the other line here, if you go from one to the other ones, you create the investments necessary to produce also output and employment, and they are quite significant, and it's possible to show that they're higher than the ones from brown types of investment. I don't have much more time, but let's go to the next one. The problem of that, and let's go back to the discussions that we had about the modeling of this process, is that most of the modeling consider investments and finance as endogenous variables, and that allows you does not allow you to understand what constrains investments. I mean, if it is so lucrative or so profitable to make the transition, why investments and finance provided for decarbonization are so low? And as a matter of fact, I mean, if you look at the level of investments necessary for decarbonization, the climate investment in finance, they are nowadays much lower than those required for the transformation to avoid further climate change. Second, next one, please. They also do not explain finance, what is happening in finance. We know, for instance, that climate risk has been rising very rapidly, and there is a reallocation of portfolio towards investments, towards instruments that are backed by low carbon assets. But we do not understand very clearly how this is going to impact, first of all, how you can increase the allocation of finance in order to achieve a global level the process of the investments required for the process of decarbonization. What you know, for instance, is that there's a concentration of those fundings in few countries that have some institutional capacity to absorb those fundings. Next one, please. Also, we are far from understanding how integrating the issues of physical risk and transition risks in Minsky's theory of investment in order to understand how climate change in itself is changing the long-term expectations, but also the reaction function of the creators of credit, money and credit in the world. Next, please. For those who are not familiar with those issues, the physical risks are those created by increasing extreme events that are impacting, for instance, infrastructure, productive capacity, and so on. Transition risk is a different animal. It's related to the changes in policy and reputation how this can impact on the demand for assets that are not sustainable. Now, next one, please. So I hope I could make the case, I'm not sure if I did, and I apologize I did not make, that we are still struggling with, first of all, the inadequacy of mainstream economics in dealing with the main issues, particularly those that impact the supply side of the functioning of the economies, not to mention the institutional sides and so on. But we are not, even in the more heterodox approaches, we have not achieved a narrative of how the economies function as inequality is rising, and as we approach, as we accelerate the process of climate change, and we reach the process we achieve climate emergency. There are at least 6 boxes that I think we need to fulfill in terms of research activity. First of all, building a systemic understanding of the process of transformation and decarbonization. The ones that we have nowadays, they make assumptions about the sources of investment and the investment themselves, I mean, the investment functions that are far from being the ones that can be observed, and that theoretically wrong in many ways coming from a heterodox perspective. The second thing, we do not have a full understanding of, giving this the narrative that we have, what are the requirements in terms of planning and alignment of instruments and the role of states and markets in this process. And that is fundamental, because in order to have the right economic policies, you have to define what instruments you can use, how you can align them, and what kind of incentives you have to create in order to produce an aligned movement with public and private institutions. Third, we do not have a full understanding. That comes to my first comments that I made about the World Bank and the IMF. What are the main roles of macro, meso, and micro policies to address these issues? How they have to be integrated? For instance, what is the IMF would be discussing the macroeconomic policies, but can we look at interest rates and can we look at monetary policy, fiscal policies, trade policies, and other types of macroeconomic policies in the same way that we looked at 20 years ago? Fourth, we have to have a better understanding of the role of policy instruments. And when I say policy instruments, for instance, I'm referring from agencies to public banks, to institutions that regulate the markets. How critical are those policies instruments, and how they have to be aligned in order to create an investment environment? And when I say investment environment, I'm not talking about the view that you have to have just regulations. You have to create an investment environment in terms of cost of capital, incentives for innovations, and mechanisms to crowd in private sector. Fifth, we have to have a better understanding of the role that international insertion plays, how investment, trade, and people integration can facilitate domestic transformation, decarbonization. It's always important to go back to Polanyi and look at these issues from the lenses of labor, land, labor, and money not being physical assets or something, but not being commodities, but being part of the public or the general institutional setting that we have all defined for ourselves. Next one. So just to go back to the research and policy issues that I would have in my mind, first, we need, in order to create climate actions that is required, but also actions in terms of just transition, we have to have a better understanding of, as I said, a better narrative in order to create the vision and the modeling of the process. We have to understand better the role of macroeconomic instruments and other policy issues, mesoeconomic issues such as preparing, scaling up, and aggregating investments required for the transition. And we also have to think about the bridges that have to be created in order to facilitate the process. Okay, I'll stop here with 1 hour, 12 minutes, and to hear your comments and questions and debates.
Well, we can hear you guys.
Thank you.
It's not working.
Thank you very much, Professor Rogério Studart. I think it's not working fine here, but if you can listen me, Roberto Board, Professor of Economics here. So I will.
He can listen you well if you go close to the Elgar.
Okay, so we are going to collect a few questions, but I'd like to pose one first, given the prerogative here, and thanks so much for your lecture. And my question is, well, how do you see the international context? You mentioned about the war, right, at the beginning of your presentation, but how do you see this sort of fragmentation instead of integration that would be needed even in the multilateral institutions for tackling an issue of decarbonization and the investments we need to transform the economies, right, in the planet, right? So how do you see this international context and the role of multilateral institutions? So I'll collect some questions here. Please, if you can come nearby here, it would be, as the mic not working, I think we just stay here.
Professor Rogério,
You can introduce yourself.
oh, I'm Leonardo. I'm an engineering scholar, and I'm studying exactly this subject for my thesis. I really appreciate your presentation. It's fantastic. I haven't had the opportunity to study all the articles you indicated, but I will start by the green reboot for emerging markets. And my question, I have two questions actually, Professor, which is first, the new Schumpeterian approach, I think, must be included in every kind of discussion on national innovation systems. It's very necessary, but, and I would like to understand your opinion on terminology. Do you agree with this terminology of neo-Schumpeterian, or do you think there is other ones? And the other question is related to this, which is, if the accumulation in the current mode of production, capitalism, is in a complete conflict with the environment, and we could call even this is a kind of Ponzi scheme for the biogeochemical cycle of the planet Earth. So we are seeking infinite accumulation based on only monetary indicators, but that's leading us to destruction. And basically, my question then is, in the place of this, we have the need for optimization. So we do want to progress and grow, but we want to do this in a sustainable way, right? And we can identify, based on information symmetry, that some activities are better performed in a decentralized way or distributed way, and other ones are better performed in the centralized way. But we still have this information symmetry and even communication and language problems, which the internet has been overcoming fantastically. But still, I would like to know your opinion on how we could do this. And thank you very much again.
Any other questions? Then we close this block. Any other? No? So
Hi, first of all, thank you for the questions and the comments. But I did not hear who was the professor who first asked the question.
Roberto Borghi.
Let me go first to Leonardo, and I'll come back to you because I think the things link. First of all, I think to be very frank with you, I don't think I succeed to make the presentation that I wanted because it was supposed to be something very simple, but I got so nervous that it got really complicated. Okay, I apologize for that, and I hope that by answering some of your questions, I can redeem myself. Leonardo, let's start with the point of capitalism being leading to the contradictions that I mentioned, inequality and climate change. Yes, I mean, it does. But particularly, and one of the role that, for instance, Keynes had in terms of the thinking of the future of capitalism, he was very conservative in a way. He wanted to maintain capitalism, is that you have to put some constraints in the way market forces would work by themselves. I mean, the market forces, I mean, the main stimulus for an economy, even since Marx spotted that in a market economy, is to accumulate the fastest and the easiest way it can. It doesn't matter, and this logic became even more significant when you create large corporations, which that implies that they function in a way to respond to the shareholders, and sometimes that creates even personal contradictions. So you have, for instance, CEOs that are concerned with those issues, but they simply cannot stop the actions because the shareholders are saying to them, don't stop. Let's take the CEO of BlackRock, who I met just by chance. He was until very recently saying we should go ahead and disinvest from carbon intensive investments and go into sustainable investment. He was demonstrating his own concern about it. But at the end of the day, particularly after the war in Ukraine, he changed his position completely because the logic of the system is that a company should be concerned mainly with its profits and providing shareholders with the highest dividends returns. And so Keynes was basically saying, in my view, is that there are some ways, I mean, this is a system, Marx in a way was right, that leads to contradiction, which in the case of Marx was what was going to make the capitalist system fade away in the class struggle that would allow it to overcome its systems. Of course, the contradictions that we see now is of a different nature. The system, because it was liberalized in a way that we had not seen after the war, but very recently became the constraints have been taken out, particularly on financial capital. The system has accelerated incredibly its need to use resources and produce the results that are expected by shareholders. And that's very destructive. So in a way, the only way to stop that is to rethink the economic system that we have. The challenge is how you do that within a capitalist economy, because we do not know, it has been so much, even in China, it has become so strong in terms of how you see the functioning and the incentives in the economy. It has become so strong that it's difficult to think about in the medium term changes that significant. So how you do that by redefining the narrative, showing even for a market economy, this is not sustainable. This system cannot endure. We have to create significant change. In order to show that, to bring that to the attention, both of the economic profession, but also other political actors, you have to have a different narrative. And that's why you have to go back to to a different narrative than the one that has prevailed. And that's my main concern here. So your question about the Schumpeterian approach, I think it is what is important. Schumpeter is incredible, and I think that it needs to be revisited. And that's how the genius of economics, I think that they may differ, but they're complementary. I see complementarities between Keynes, Kalecki, but also Keynes and Schumpeter, and even Hayek and many others. Different angles of the thing, different narratives allow you to understand different part of the equation, because economics is a narrative. It's not a science. It's a narrative that allows you to understand the system, but also to use that narrative in order to produce policies and strategies within the system. Schumpeter is extraordinary when it comes to showing that the long-term expectations are affected by innovation, but also that innovation is the vehicle through which the system changes. So if you want to talk about transformation, decarbonization, Schumpeter is pretty much important. It's important in a simple way to show that if you innovate, a transformation and a transition to low carbon economy is an innovation itself. It creates the new frontiers for accumulation for the market system itself. And that is clear, by the way. For instance, China is positioning itself to become the leader in terms of producing green technology, but also greening its financial systems and greening its international relations in order to achieve their goal. So using Schumpeter to show that transformation, decarbonization is the way to expanding the possibilities of the system itself and avoiding it to become unsustainable. And for me, it's absolutely important. The international situation, Roberto, I think you allow me to call you Roberto. I think you're completely right. The international situation becomes a significant constraint for a rapid process of transformation, because it is a global issue that you could accelerate the transition through technological transfers for investments, through international investments, through international finance. If the geopolitical fragmentation increases, not only that, but the multilateral collaboration required to deal with the problem becomes very weak. So, having said that, that does not imply that it even for national economies, take the case of Brazil, even if you're not concerned about the role of Brazil as a global player in the climate issue, you have to consider that Brazil can benefit from the transition, but also must do some sort of transition, at least to become more resilient to climate change. The economies are pretty soon going to get stuck with the loss of productivity and competitiveness due to climate events in the future. So national responses are required independently of how the international geopolitical situation goes. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's the point I wanted to make.
Any other questions? Anyone? Here. Where? Okay. Any other? Only. So the final question, please. You can come here. Yeah.
Do you listen to me?
Yes.
Rogério? Okay. My name is Diogo. I have two questions. The first one is a quick question about methodology. You you quote some CGE models. I would like to ask you if you have heard about any CGE models with financial sector extension, because there are some with this kind of approach, but I don't know if any one of them deals with the climate change concerns. Maybe this kind of models with the financial sector extension should give us some insights to relating the relation between finance and decarbonization challenges. I don't know if you have if you know some model that do this. The second one is about how we can think to induce banks to finance all these concerns, all these challenges that we have in the decarbonization debate, especially in emergent countries, I think, because the finance investment saving funding circuits, the Keynesian circuit, the fifth circuit, and I'm not really sure that it works well in the developing countries, because it's not a problem, it's not only a theoretical problem that the government or the central banks assume or admit that banks can create money. It's not, I think that's not it's not this problem, but also a problem that in these countries, banks are not prepared, or maybe they don't have the strong incentives or sufficient incentives to finance companies, especially because in these countries, our national companies are not the main ones that can lead the economy, can lead the transformation of the economy, the structural transformation, you know, because we rely heavily on transnational companies in every sector. The leading companies in most of the sectors are not national companies, and these transnational companies, they finance them abroad. They don't rely on the national banking system, and the national companies who need the local banking system cannot use this system because banks are not willing to finance them. I don't know if it became clear, but my worry is about how we can think in new policies that can induce banks to do their job. Thanks.
Diogo, thank you very much for again asking questions that allow me to explain a little bit more these issues that are really important. Methodology. You're so right. I mean, two of the main problems that I found in the CGEs models used to look at transition is that they do not have finance or investment function in it. And that's what I was trying to show. Well, you have to look at those systems basically as a production engineer modeling type. I love the production engineers, but it shows a little bit how it is a little bit mechanical in a way. So you have a point here, and you have the emissions of carbon, and you want to come to 2050 with this emission level here, and then you look at the sectors that the most emitters, for instance, energy. So if you have to change from fossil fuel energy produced by fossil fuel to renewable energy. Let's take this example, okay? And as you do that, you produce. You have a effective demand equation there, which is an interesting thing to look at. You produced investments. That investment increases production, increases saving. The saving that you're creating, you use that to invest furthermore in the sector. So the saving is, the process creates at the same time the investment because it's determined, and the savings is the source of funding of the process. That does not by any means explain how investments are financed and how the investment decisions are taken. So you end up in models that, where the financial institution, the financial structure, the policies to create the incentives for financiers to finance the transition and so on, they're just taken out. But they are good in terms of showing what is the potential of the economy. What those systems show to you is that if we used every dollar that we are not investing in fossil fuels into renewable energy, for instance, how much output, how much employment, how much growth, and of course, how much lower emission we will achieve. So this is, as the background and the narrative, it is good. I haven't seen, to respond to your question, I haven't seen any of those models introducing either a financial theory of investments like in Minsky or any discussion of finance. I haven't seen any of these models have a discussion of why the entrepreneur, why she would take that investment. Who is going to invest? Is it going to be the public sector or is it going to be the private sector? If it is the private sector, what is the determinant of the long-term expectations that are going to make those agents go from one point to the other? And that is important to spell out, and that's, for instance, what new Schumpeterian authors are so important in this discussion. They are important in many other discussions, to say, no. You have to create a path of innovation through green technology that allows the investors to look at that as an increase of market frontiers. And then it comes the whole discussion of industrial policies. It comes with the whole discussions of funding policies. It comes with the whole discussions of macroeconomic instruments. What is the role of interest rates and fiscal policy in this game? You start opening up, but you have to have a skeleton to show how you get from one point to the other. What else? What I was trying to share with you is that we need to work in filling those gaps in order to get a better narrative. And you cannot fill these gaps if you start with a theory where finance and uncertainty is not even taking consideration of the narrative of the economy. So that's the. I hope I answer your question. I think this is a very important research aspects to define both the economic narrative of the transition, but also once you have that, what kind of instruments are necessary, what kind of institutions are necessary in order to push for that change. So, Diogo, that was an important question. That comes, the question about banks is inserted in the same kind of issue. First, you have to consider that banks are a critical actor in changing not only the level of output, but changing the level of investment that is going to create the transformation that you need. If you start with a theory where banks are just intermediaries, how you can get there? That's how I struggled so much. I started putting so much energy into looking at the mainstream economics, and even with some of our mainstream Keynesian economists, to say we cannot afford to keep this kind of vision because you're going to end up with the same approach of the IMF, the World Bank, which looks at money, banks, financial institutions that's irrelevant, that does not dig into the investment functions to understand how they can be changed. Banks, the financial sectors can be moved by at least three factors here in this game. Minsky already defined in his, I believe, his financial theory of investments, the issues of risk, of lenders' risk and borrower risk, and how that, at the end of the day, define the conditions to invest and the level of invest that is going to achieve. So you can think about how to change lenders' risks and borrowers' risk in the game. Banks, the financial institutions also change through the climate change itself, because the climate risk is changing very rapidly. I'll give an example, not to be too abstract. If you think about the fires that are happening in California or in Europe, imagine all those institutional investors that, of course, first of all, you have to imagine the suffering that you're imposing a lot of people to that. But from a financial perspective, think about all the insurers, the institutional investors that have assets that are backed by real estate, by industry, by infrastructure, which are in the middle of the fire. What would you, or if you look at the resorts by the sea, look at those who have invested in resorts and they're looking at the water sea level going up. That means that the climate risk is going to increase, and that is going to create a portfolio change, a diversification of portfolio that is creating a flow of finance that can finance part of the transition. Even understanding this mechanism is necessary in order to make policies. What policies you should entertain in order to accelerate this process is saying, okay, I'm going to create regulations in order to increase the transition risks, or I'm going to increase regulations which is going to benefit even further those intermediaries that go from brown to green types of investments. So I think that there's a window of opportunity to accelerate the financial flows to transformation. But before that, you have to have a theory that shows very clearly that by changing the behavior of banks and other financial intermediaries and greening your financial sector can be a way of accelerating change. And that's something that you don't have in most of the economic analysis that I observe, both in the orthodox and the heterodox economics. Of course, I'm just saying what I perceive. It's not necessarily what is out there, because I don't know everything that is out there. Diego, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you a lot.
So thank you so much, Professor Rogério Studart. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you for the invitation. Again, it is, for me, it gave me the opportunity of sharing with you some of my anxieties, not in terms of the need for transformation, but also the need for transforming the way we think of economics, given the challenges that we have in front of us. So thank you very much, and enjoy the course, and have a great day. And as we say in Portuguese, fora Bolsonaro.
Thank you.
Thank you. So have a break now, 20 minutes, come back here.